Everybody, my name is Benjamin Tallis from the Institute of International Relations, and I'm joined this morning for a panel on Czech foreign policy in turbulent times 2, which builds on the first panel that we had this morning, by three colleagues from the Institute of International Relations. Firstly by Michal Kořan, then by Rudolf Fürst, and then Michal Šimečka. Our colleague Lukáš Tiki sends his apologies and so will remain quiet. Our panel this morning on foreign policy in turbulent times builds on the discussion we heard earlier and will address some of the themes and hopefully some of the controversies that were raised. We heard yesterday that this is not a conference that is shy of, or indeed a symposium, that is shy of dealing with the difficult and controversial issues. We seek to actively take them on, and that's exactly what I hope our panelists will do this morning. We have comments from Rudolf Fürst on Czech-Chinese relations, which clearly has provoked quite some discussion amongst the media and amongst the public, as well as politicians in the last year, particularly with the visit of Xi Jinping to Prague. We also have Michal Kořan, who will be talking about the thorny issue of the Visegrad 4, big bad Visegrad, as The Economist labelled it earlier in the year. And we might perhaps ask, indeed, V4, what is it good for? And I will be questioning Michal on that as we go through the presentation. But we also have the presentation of a policy paper that I can see my colleagues have already picked up a copy of, and so can you from the foyer through there if you don't already have one. This is called Czech Strategic Partnerships, a practice in need of a vision. And this is a paper that I co-authored together with my colleague Michal Šimečka, although I should say it was mostly Michal's work. What I would put to you, though, is that the title of this paper could actually be referred to, or used to refer to Czech foreign policy more widely, a practice in need of a vision. Referring back to Petr Kratikville's remarks to open the conference yesterday, when we think about strategy, which is indeed the theme of the conference and the theme of this paper, we shouldn't only think about pragmatic calculation or prioritization of particular issues, but we need to think about vision. We need to think about leadership and how we actually achieve what it is we want to achieve in the world. It's increasingly a matter of consensus, and this is going to be controversial straight from the beginning. It is increasingly a matter of consensus within as well as outside these walls that there is a lack of vision and leadership in Czech foreign policy. It is increasingly apparent to media commentators, to academics, to think tankers, and to professional diplomats and policymakers. In the last discussion on the panel, when we talked about human rights and the controversy that has ensued from what was indeed billed and presented as a major change, a rupture, if not necessarily a revolution, to use Veronika Bilkova's terms, in the Czech Republic's human rights policy, Ondřej Hlukan mentioned that this has had an identity effect, or it's to do with identity issues in Czech foreign policy. I would agree entirely, and the identity effect has been to confuse the Czech Republic's foreign policy identity. What, may we ask, today can the Czech Republic be relied upon by its partners to provide in the world and in its actions? What can the Czech Republic be counted for to do? We can see, however, that this confusion reflects a lack of priority of foreign policy in Czech political discourse and public discourse more widely, as well as within the political parties. And this, as a foreign policy community, is something that we need to be seriously thinking about how to address. We cannot accept a situation where foreign policy, which is of the highest importance for this country as well as every other, is used as a means for only domestic ends, or worse, for partisan purpose. Some blame this lack of prioritization of foreign policy on an introverted nature, or an unwillingness or a shyness to engage, difficulties with English perhaps. But we can see that this country has been at its greatest when it has been at its most confident, its most willing to engage with the world, and its most demanding of a place at the top table. Be that in the First Republic or in the post-89 period when demanding EU accession and NATO membership. How can we regenerate such feeling of belonging in the world stage? How can we regenerate an openness that draws on a Czech confidence rather than a shyness, an inward turn, and worries about our society in the face of the arrival of foreigners, including myself as well as Muslims? With these questions in mind, I would turn to our first panelist, Michal Šimečka, to present our paper on Czech Strategic Partnerships. Then we will move on to Rudolf Fürst, and then on to Michal Kořan. So, Michal, please take us away.
Thanks a lot, Ben. As a way of introduction, I should say that this is part of a larger, or the policy paper that you have in front of you is part of a larger research project or research report generously supported by Thatcher and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on one particular trait or facet of Czech foreign policy, even a trend one could say, and that's the practice of strategic partnerships or of labeling particular bilateral relations as strategic or as being of strategic character. And we've seen that in the last couple of years, certainly under this government, this has become much more prominent. Also in the 2015 foreign policy concept, there are a number of countries labeled as strategic partners. These are Poland, Israel, South Korea, France. Germany is often considered probably the quintessential strategic partner of the Czech Republic. Then obviously the United States is considered a strategic partner. And then most recently, the Czech Republic included strategic partnerships, formal strategic partnerships with Azerbaijan in the autumn last year and with China during the president's visit this year. So what we see is an expansion of this practice, both formally and substantively, but there isn't sort of a commensurate or an adequate strive to explain and understand what it actually means. What are these strategic partnerships for? What distinguishes, why are some countries labeled as strategic partners and others are not? Why is Poland a strategic partner and Slovakia is not, for instance, or why is Azerbaijan and Ukraine is not? These are all the questions that have to do also with the definition of the concept itself and the kind of criteria on the basis of which we think about what does strategicness imply. So our paper and our research project looked into these questions and tried to kind of rectify the situation and propose perhaps a conceptual framework for the pursuit of Czech strategic partnerships more productively, because we think there is in the instrument itself, which actually has very different institutional shapes when it comes to different countries. It could be strategic dialogue as it is in Germany, or it could be intergovernmental consultation as it is with Poland, or joint government sessions as with Israel. So they have very different institutional shapes, these strategic partnerships. And we think that instrument in itself has considerable promise. But there needs to be some more thinking done on how this promise can be fulfilled. And in particular, we think there are three functions or three purposes that these strategic partnerships, as an instrument, this partnership could fulfill. And one is the intuitive one, which is to deepen our relations with that particular country or particular partner. And this has served the Czech Republic pretty well. This bilateral purpose, for instance, in relations with Germany, the establishment of the strategic dialogue in the summer of last year was rather well timed and helped mitigate the brewing conflict over the refugee crisis. So in that sense, it served this particular purpose. But you can also think of strategic partnerships in a wider sense, not just as vehicles for deepening of bilateral relations, but also as a way of creating hierarchies and priorities for Czech foreign policy as such, in the sense that the act of, or the choice of elevating a particular bilateral partnership to a strategic level is itself an important signal of where our priorities lie. And that's an important signal externally as well as internally for the allocation of resources. And the third purpose or function of these partnerships is even broader, and it speaks to what Ben alluded to. That's the formation or cultivation of an identity of the Czech Republic on the international stage, so that the collection of our strategic partnerships should reflect to some extent our Czech Republic's vision of the world, its values perhaps, and its kind of overall ambition in the international arena. Now, but for this instrument to fulfill these purposes, it needs a bit of an unpacking. So let me just very briefly take you through how this how this concept has been approached in the academic literature, because obviously it's not just the Czech Republic that has made extensive use of this label or of this instrument without actually knowing what it really means. It's a fairly common practice in international diplomacy, especially after the Cold War. Indeed, most countries now have strategic partnerships with one another, or even various kind of semantic variations of that, which to some extent, or that's how it's explained, or could be perhaps explained, speaks to the complexity of international diplomacy after the Cold War, where the traditional notions of alliance and friendship and cooperation and simple partnerships, or indeed enmity or adversarial relations, so these are no longer sufficient, so you have to come up with these creative notions such as strategic partnerships. And there are at least three ways of looking at it, at the concept. One is a very, pragmatic or cynical one, which would mean that the adjective strategic signifies a diminished character of the partnership itself. So it's not like a complete partnership where there is full alignment of interests and norms. Because the adjective strategic evokes some sort of a pragmatic calculation, so therefore strategic partnerships is actually meant to disguise the conflictual or transactional nature of the relationship. So that's one way. The other way of looking at it, obviously, is to take the concept at face value and see it as a sui generis mode of interstate alignment or relation, and seeing it as distinct from alliance, and on the one hand distinct from coalitions, and then the defining characteristic of this strategic partnership, if we take it at face value, would be the existence of a common goal or of a common purpose, of a common strategic objective, which is unattainable for the partners without their mutual cooperation. And finally, the third way of looking at strategic partnerships, the third way of conceptualizing them, has to do with identity and with what could be called their constitutive function, in the sense that when you establish a strategic partnership with another country, it creates, so to speak, a new identity for both partners vis-a-vis each other, so that it has a transformative potential on that particular bilateral relationship, because you set up new institutions, because you commit yourself to specific goals, and that in itself has the potential to change the nature of that relationship. This is, for instance, how the European Union thinks of its strategic partnerships. The EU has 10 of them, and exactly perceives them as a way of projecting its particular it's universal values across the world, and it's also a marker of its geopolitical positioning. So in that sense, it also reflects and shapes EU's identity as an international actor. Now, on the basis of this discussion, let me just close by outlining what it offers for understanding Czech foreign or Czech strategic partnerships. And on that basis, we have constructed 5 or 6 rather categories, which is say elements of a definition. I mean, we don't see the need for a rigorous definition of Czech strategic partnerships, but we think there are at least these elements which make them meaningful. So the first one is common purpose, that both strategic partners should have a common, that the partnership should be based on a long-term and broadly conceived common purpose. The second one is reciprocity, which implies a degree of asymmetry in the sense that the objective to which these two partners are committed must be realized in cooperation and cannot be realized independently. The third one is comprehensiveness, that is not just about security or not just about trade and economics, but covers the whole range of policy areas. The other criteria, if you wish, is contextual coherence, in the sense that the collection of a country's partnerships should be somewhat coherent, and it could be both coherent in itself as a group, but also with Czech foreign policy priorities and interests. And the last one is that there should be a degree of domestic consensus in the Czech Republic among the various stakeholders that a particular relationship is indeed strategic. so I'll just close with a brief note on how the existing Czech partnerships, strategic partnerships, are doing if measured against these benchmarks. And I would say that most of them exhibit these qualities or meet these criteria of strategicness. They have a common purpose. They are reciprocal to a certain extent, comprehensive and coherent, with the possible exception, or possible with the real exception, of Azerbaijan and to some extent China. And I'll just briefly outline the Azerbaijani case, which the problem there is not just the poor human rights record of Baku, but also that it's absolutely an outlier if compared to other strategic partnerships of the Czech Republic, being Poland, Germany, the United States, South Korea, and Israel, in the sense that it cannot possibly be conceived as a realization of Czech foreign policy interest to the degree that relationship with Poland or Germany is, and there's absolutely no domestic consensus on the strategic nature of our relations with Azerbaijan. China's case is obviously very different, and that's where probably Rudolf will pick up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michal. So yes, indeed, let's hand over to Rudolf.
Thank you.
Oh, I see. Thank you very much. I was impressed by the list of Czech strategic partnerships. I didn't know that we have had so many. As to the partnership with China, it has been a surprise for me, even though that I was aware that our bilateral relations with this Asian power were rapidly increasing. I have been interested in Czech-Chinese relations for about 15 years, and this development is somehow very much positive because, frankly, no matter that we have fundamentally different political culture and political views and political ideas about almost everything, China has always been an interesting country for the Czech business circles, and there is a long tradition of Czechoslovakian Chinese relations that dates back to the 20th century or even earlier. Why the Czech-Chinese Strategic Partnership has come to existence right now? This is the result of more outer circumstances, but it was also a result of Czech individual policies. Institute of International Relations is just placing my new policy paper on web pages, which is focused on the 1+16 format. That means this is the regional organization that was established between China and 16 post-communist European countries. We are one of them, and me and my colleagues, we conducted research that traced the individual bilateral relations of all those post-communist European states with China, and the outcome of our effort was a matrix of ratings, which helps us to answer the question what China wants and what China needs and what are the goals of the European partners. We can see the structure of economic as well as political needs, and we can see that the Visegrad 4 states are very prominent in the eyes of Chinese. This is because of the diplomatic and international relevance of Poland, of course. The Polish are the leader who achieved to get to establish deeper relations with China. The Poland is a very interesting country because it has been very pro-Chinese, as well it is very much pro-Western and pro-NATO country that may portray the attitudes of similar states who are inside the EU and whose security concerns are very much linked to NATO, but still they are open for developing relations with China, which is by mainstream European states not perceived as a security issue. Our metrics that we developed shows that despite the nominally declared strategic partnerships, there are very poor results of that in terms of economic outcomes. As that means the level of Chinese investments in the post-communist Europe and the export of those states to China were very poor. Why the format of 1+16 did not provide some more effective support? The answer is very plain. China organized this 1+16 format for its own interest, and this is to gain easier access to EU common market. Even so, the post-communist states are somehow underestimated. Still, the group of 16 represents 1/3 of the EU common market, which is very attractive for China. EU and China established their strategic partnership even earlier in 2003. So I suggest to observe the format of 1+16 as an additional regional format which belongs to the architecture of China-EU strategic relationship. Why the Czech-Chinese strategic partnership was declared right now? I would suggest this is just a natural development. We just Czech political parties gained unusually high level of consensus, and China is becoming more interested in us. If we follow the schemes and map which China is issued as a One Belt, One Road strategic super project, we can see the link or the strategic plan to interconnect all the global international regional formats which China established, and to shift the strategic transportation network from sea to the continent. So for the Chinese, there is a priority to connect its own western domestic provinces with Central Asia, and then to prolong this link through Russia to Middle East and to Eastern Europe. And the end of this network is actually the Western Europe, and specifically maybe Manchester, which is on the most western part of the China Silk Road, because the super train is just being planned to be built to connect London and this city. Czech Republic is somehow bypassed by this strategic transportation network, and this shows that Czech position is somehow very unique because of the structure of our need. We do not need Chinese investments or we do not need especially so much investment in those fields that China is offering. China is exporting its overcapacities in the energy industry and in the transportation construction industry, which may find more convenient places in Balkans or elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Czech Republic needs other structure or other kinds of investment. So far we received the first, let's say, important package of investments from China into financial services, into healthcare, into purchasing of real estate, into aviation industry, and into, let's say, production of food and nanotechnologies. The structure of this investments looks somehow more Western than Eastern Europe. From this point of view, the Czech Republic is quite a very modern country, and this is a very positive shift that I can witness, because our previous efforts were focused on establishing joint ventures in the heavy industry or in engineering. Now the common trend is more suitable to the Czech role, which is more specialized on aviation and on city transportation systems. That's why we are becoming more successful in exports in China, because we provide better products, we are more professional, and we achieved to find strategic partners, not just to rely on ourselves. Therefore, the Czech exports to China slightly increase, even so that our political relations with China have been complicated many times by our assertive support for human rights. So my vision of this development is somehow cautiously optimistic. This is not just that we signed the paper that we are strategic partners, but the trend seems to be very positive, and we just enjoy a good time to promote our ties with China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rudolf. Plenty of food for thought there, so I'm sure many of you are already readying your questions, which there will be time for afterwards. Michal, Kořan, please, to talk about Visegrad 4.
Thank you very much. Obviously, the Visegrad Group or Visegrad cooperation is not covered by any strategic relation paper, but I will touch on the issue of leadership that Ben mentioned. And let me just precede my presentation by saying that I never thought that speaking about the Visegrad Group could be a controversial issue, and here we are now. Okay. The Visegrad Group has an irreplaceable and indispensable position in the Czech foreign policy. I would start with that. Despite all the controversies that surrounded politics in Central Europe in the past 2 years or so, the Visegrad Group is a unique platform for communication, cooperation, stabilization and moderation in a region which is historically replete with neighborly jealousy and tensions. The Visegrad cooperation also became an important tool of the Czech diplomacy. It's a tool that helps to trim down certain asymmetries that stem from the relative smallness of our country. However, we can see that there is something seriously wrong with the image of the V4 lately. One of the reasons for this negative image is that the nature of the Visegrad Group is rather more often than not is fundamentally misinterpreted and misunderstood. Second reason of the negative image is that there are serious and grave problems within the Central European regions and within the countries that form the Visegrad Group. And these problems do have some ramifications into the Visegrad Group as such. In order to help the V4 to keep the features, the positive features that are beneficial and once again indispensable for the region, and we can get to that, why indispensable later, the ultimate goal is to prevent the notion of the V4 from hijacking by those political figures throughout the region that project their national political ambitions and that abuse this platform for satisfaction of their domestic goals. Unfortunately, this hijacking has partly already taken place, and it is of an utmost importance for the Czech diplomacy to turn this process around. Indeed, in the recent months, we witness an undeclared fight for the dominant narrative of what the Visegrad Group is, or what the Visegrad Group should be. Throughout the history of the V4, we can see that the dominant narrative is changing. It's in a constant flux. Without dwelling too much in history, I can remind of 4 of those dominant narratives. The first one, back in the early 1990s, the V3 was thought to be a vehicle that will help to end the division of Europe. Later on, throughout the 1990s, the V4 was seen as a vehicle that will help the 4 countries to technically and bureaucratically integrate into the EU and the NATO. Then we had a short phase when no one pretty much knew what the V4 is good for, And so we tended to say that the V4 is a good regional trademark. I mean, once we have it, why not to use it at least for something, right? And then later on, roughly around 2007 or 8, the dominant narrative was that the V4 is here to display solidarity and broad responsibility with the region of Eastern and Southeastern Europe, that the V4 is here to help these regions to get integrated into the EU and to the NATO. Obviously, this last narrative disintegrated very quickly after the unfortunate events in Eastern Ukraine. It is important to stress that none of these narratives reflected the actual nature of the Visegrad cooperation. These narratives were and are rather prisms through which the group was interpreted in political terms. And as I said, at this point we are witnessing a very poisonous contest over the new dominant narrative. There is Hungary, followed by Poland and by Slovakia at some times, that attempt to interpret the recent Visegrad Group as a finally maturing sub-regional pressure group that finally got rid of its shyness and is able to speak up for itself and to safeguard the region against the oppressive practices of Brussels. This is one of the attempted narrative to be imposed on the Visegrad Group. In some Polish political and thinker circles, we could also witness the renaissance of the notion of the Visegrad Group or Central Europe as a core of a broader Eastern European geopolitical cordon between Russia and Germany. On the other hand, the Czech Republic, mostly through its presidency, which ended in July, aimed to adopt a very different approach. For various reasons, the Czech presidency tried to steer the V4 into a, let's say, safer, if less ambitious harbor of enhancing the mutual trust and regional cohesion. I have to say that my evaluation of the Czech diplomacy in Central Europe under the government of Bohuslav Sobotka, despite some important but unnecessary controversies that surrounded the start of his Central European policy, is generally positive. The Czech diplomacy managed to play a moderating role, which must have been a very difficult task on many occasions. However, the Czech Republic did not manage to prevent the Hungarians, but also partly Slovak and Polish leaders from overwhelming and, forgive me the expression, hijacking the overall notion of the Visegrad Group. This, in turn, contributed to the shockingly quick damnation of the Visegrad Group abroad and within the region itself. The damnation of the state of politics in Central Europe has a lot of merit, and there are possible future scenarios that might be truly tragic. Yet I would warn against mingling the notion of the Visegrad cooperation with the state of the politics in Central Europe in general. The Visegrad Group is too valuable to let it loose because of tempocentrist or temporary interpretation of its nature. Damning of the V4 at recent turbulent times reminds me of a position of the then Prime Minister Václav Klaus, who despised the V4 in the 1990s for being a club of poor, undeveloped countries. In the mid-1990s, he actively prevented the Czech diplomacy from participation on the V4 events because he was afraid that the V4 membership would somehow harm our path to the rich Western club. Looking backwards, we now know that it was a nonsense. And I would like to paraphrase one famous IR scholar: V4 is what we make of it, not what is imposed on us. If we give in to those who are trying to steal the notion of the V4 for their domestic purposes, we are as guilty and responsible as they are for destroying one of the most precious and miraculous development in Central Europe in its history. I cannot imagine how politics in Central Europe would look like nowadays without the Visegrad Group, which is capable of moderating and easing tensions and differences in the region. Without the V4 framework, we would be no doubt seeing more and more nationalist features stealing back into our region, and that would have tragic consequences. Also, while complaining about some political processes in the other Visegrad countries, we should not forget that we will have parliamentary elections in next year in this country. And they will probably bring some very unpleasant results. And we should not forget about our president and his approach to foreign policy. We should also avoid the kind of thinking that by getting closer to Austria or Germany, we can live without the Visegrad Group. While we should build strong partnership with Austria and Germany, our problems and our neighbors will not go away if we lose the Visegrad Group. They will stay, and we will lose the only developed platform for communication. There are two things that the Czech Republic could and perhaps should do, and I will finish on this. First, it should contribute, actively take the leadership to contribute to rebuilding and reinforcing the notion of the Visegrad, which is erected around the positive features. And there are a lot of positive features of the Visegrad Group in the history. It should not shy away from leading the Visegrad Group into a positive structure. One more ambitious and for some no doubt idealistic suggestion is that the Czech Republic might, or even should try, to initiate a pan-European political dialogue on the state of democracy and political legitimacy in Europe in general, not only in the region. By doing this, three important things would be achieved. First, it would be an initiative that stems from a very well-recognized tradition of the Czech politics, at least from the 1990s. Second, this initiative would clearly show that we take our Central European problem seriously, but at the same time, that problem with legitimacy is shared in Europe in general and is by far not limited to the Visegrad countries. Quite to the contrary, this distrust in politics and political legitimacy is tragically low throughout the so-called Western liberal world, and the consequences are getting more and more dire. Third, this dialogue should take place before some extremist groups and currents, political currents, will take the lead in the process of establishing a dialogue about the future of political nature in Europe. I know that it is a lot to ask from such a small country like the Czech Republic. It's a lot to ask from a country which does not really know how to take properly care of itself. But going back to the notion of leadership and vision, I think this is what would very much help Central Europe and the Czech foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think, yes, please join with us in thanking all of our participants today for those excellent words. Excellent and indeed provocative, I should add. And this now, let battle commence, I think is probably the best way to style this. I have some discussant comments, which I'll try to keep short for each of the presenters, but then what we will do is open to your questions, and then I will return to the panelists for a word where they will address some of the points I raised and some of the points that you have all raised. So, first of all, to Michal Šimečka, don't you think that you, and by extension me, are being a little bit too generous to Czech foreign policy in this assessment that you've presented? I opened by actually saying we need more vision in foreign policy. We need vision to guide, rather than hoping desperately that the vision will arise from the agglomeration of our different partnerships. First of all, do you think that's a fair point? And secondly, what could be done to actually develop that vision further? What is needed in that regard, and how does that relate to strategic partnerships? How useful are they as an instrument in that regard? Secondly, isn't it about time the Czech Republic started, quote unquote, partnering down? Because we see, you mentioned that Germany, for example, is the quintessential partner for the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic is not necessarily the quintessential partner for Germany, but where is the example of the Czech Republic also looking to that, to help with countries such as Moldova, in some ways, Ukraine in other ways? How can we see actually, again, taking responsibility in this regard, rather than merely seeking to protect Czech interests through these partnerships? To Rudolf, firstly, there's been a lot of controversy about the closer engagement with China. Many have seen it as a betrayal of the previous stance on human rights and a increasing indicator of moral flexibleness, that's so flexibility in dealing with foreign policy. However, others, myself included, have argued that actually further engagement with China is a potential way to transform, and we can't expect countries to transform if we merely criticize and castigate them. What transformative potential do you see in the Czech strategic partnership with China, for China, but also for the Czech Republic? And a very specific question to do with the a one road, one belt? Is there a possibility of a spur coming down to the Czech Republic from the main route, which is something that I've heard posed? Final point to your presentation. You mentioned why the Czech Republic and why now. I think several of us would have some other reasons why the Czech Republic. Indeed, again, a slightly flexible attitude towards corruption, a willingness to potentially hide certain forms of funding, the involvement of certain fairly shady figures. We needn't name names, but I think we know who we're talking about. How would you address these kind of allegations that are often raised? Is the Czech Republic at risk of putting itself in a very dangerous position in terms of its reputation by actually taking this morally flexible attitude? Or again, do you see it as a pragmatic policy, or even that these criticisms are unfounded? To Michal Kořan, well, yeah, where to start? We have quite different views on this. If I were to be able to give one piece of advice to the Czech foreign minister directly and to the office of the government, it would be leave Visegrad. Immediately. This is the thing that is tarring your reputation more than any other. You are being lumped in with an increasingly authoritarian turn of nasty right-wing populists in Central and Eastern Europe. Again, the question of engagement versus criticism comes to mind there. There's definitely an issue to be answered. But it seems to me as though you outline what is in effect a Visegrad 1 and a Visegrad 1 of your imagination. It is indeed what we make of it to a certain extent, but the Visegrad that you outline seems to be everything but what people outside know it as, and everything but what the current Polish and Hungarian governments want it to be. And I think there's a serious issue there to be said, well, yes, indeed, Visegrad has potential, but at what point do we pull the plug because it's actually become increasingly toxic? I generalize, of course, but most people, I think, in Western Europe, in policy-making circles, and certainly in the wider population, only have come to understand what the Visegrad Group is in the last few years, and it has only come when they have raised increasingly regressive policies on energy and environmentalism, first of all, and then clearly on migration and refugees. So I think there's certainly some issue to be taken there. Does Visegrad actually matter to the populations of these countries involved, or does it remain an elite initiative? There's many more things I think I could say, but I think you get the general gist of my critique there. So with that in mind, I will open to all your comments and questions, and I know there are some people who are economic experts in the room. I'm looking particularly at Older and Vladan here, who might have some points to Rudolf Fürst's presentation about investment, I would hope, but also can I just get an indication of who would like to ask a question or raise a comment? Okay, Professor Charles Gatti at the back of the room.
I'd like to commend the panel for intellectually very stimulating presentations, all of them. Whether one agrees with it or not is really secondary, but they put significant issues on the table. My view on Visegrad is not as different from Mr. Kořan's as he seems to think in private conversation. It's just, I'm talking about, and so did he, the image of Visegrad abroad in the West, and notably in Washington, where unfortunately the Czech differences with Hungary and Poland are not articulated and are not seen as being what they are, which is to say different, because Hungary has managed to set the agenda for Visegrad, and the image of Visegrad, therefore, is negative now in, I think, several Western capitals, but notably in Washington. But I'm talking about the image, but the image is extremely important in foreign affairs. That was the comment. Now, I do have a question, if I may, and which is that there is an elephant in the room that nobody has talked about, and that's Russia. I would think that when you think about Czech foreign policy or about European security, the very first question is, well, what about Russia? Well, obviously there is no strategic relationship. There is with Azerbaijan, which for the life of me I have some difficulty understanding, but that's just a word. But the relationship with Russia is critical, and I wonder if members of the panel could be enticed to make some comments about the nature of that relationship.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure, yes, several of the panelists would be happy to discuss that. Let's collect another couple of questions before we return to our panelists. Yes, please, and please introduce yourself when you speak.
Amalda Madhavni, Italian ambassador here in Prague. Just a very, very short question. Do you think that the Czech government will be able to withdraw from the V4 if the values and the interests are different? Will you have the force to do that?
Thank you, and indeed the moral courage, we might add. Who else would like to ask a question? Yes, Matthew Rhodes.
Thank you, Ben. My question goes first to Rudolf first, but also to the two other panelists. How does the strategic relationship with China, is it in any way shaped or limited by the Czechs' parallel commitments to their European and transatlantic partners?
Thank you very much. Okay, at this point we will return to our panelists. I would ask you to keep your remarks to 2 to 3 minutes so that we can come back for another round of questions. Thank you. So in the order that you presented, please, Michal Šimečka.
Thank you, Ben. On the very first one dealing with the general notion of strategic partnerships and the question you raised, obviously I was probably rather generous in the presentation, omitting the critical parts which are actually in our joint policy paper, I should add. And they are also in the recommendations in the sense that it is probably true that the current practice of Czech strategic partnerships or partnering is more of a result of rather ad hoc choices and idiosyncratic institutions rather than a thought out strategy of whom and how and for which purpose do we want to strategically partner with. That being said, they're still, just by having this architecture, institutional architecture of these partnerships, notably with Germany and Poland, there is a great potential for actually making use of it for realizing a vision, as you would put it, or a foreign policy vision. But in that sense, I would argue that the strategic partnership as an instrument is an auxiliary, or it could be used if that vision arises rather than the other way around. And as to the second question, obviously we put that as one of the recommendations that the Czech Republic should consider establishing strategic partnerships with countries which are in which it would be the senior partner, thinking either one of the Western Balkan countries, which is a long-standing priority of Czech diplomacy to support their European integration, or one of the Eastern Partnership countries. That would kind of add more balance into the assembly of Czech strategic partnerships as they are today. So that's for that. I would want also to if I may, to comment on Michal's presentation, and it somehow also relates to the notion of strategy and strategic partners, and especially obviously because Poland is a strategic partner of the Czech Republic, and I mean I very much like the way that Michal has portrayed it, and also I agree with the goals he set for Czech foreign policy to steer Visegrad away from this negative or destructive territory into which Hungary and Poland have dragged it into. My conclusion, though, would be that Czech foreign policy has tried to do it and failed, and is failing, and that's it could be because it's not trying hard enough, or it could be because it's just not possible within the parameters within the political context that we're in, and within the way that Visegrad is currently operating. And the very one thing I would mention is, for instance, this Bratislava summit, and that's I think where the problem is, that it is one thing to coordinate positions in the EU, and for even on migration, where I mean it's despicable as it is, but it could be there is some logic to it that these four countries have a shared interest in opposing the quotas. But the problem with the politics of Visegrad is broadened to key issues of Czech interest, and almost all issues pertaining to Europe. We now have a reflex, almost an instinct to create a common Visegrad position, which I think it doesn't make sense, because in most of these key issues we have just different views than Poland and Hungary. So there's a sort of almost a mission creep, if one can put it that way, which the Czech Republic seems unable to prevent.
Thank you very much, Michal. I should add that Lukáš Tichý, who was supposed to join us today, was indeed going to be talking about Russia in specific terms on the panel. So in his silence, we will hope to fill in a little bit as panelists. We're going to break the order slightly, so go to Michal Kořan to address the points that have been raised about Visegrad in particular, before then coming to Rudolf first. So Michal Kořan, please.
Thank you. Thank you for extremely important remarks that you made, and very, very serious. And once again, I wish we were back in those times when Visegrad was a boring topic, but that's no more the case. To what Michal said, I don't think that the Czech diplomacy tried hard. I actually don't think that it tried at all. I was sitting here in this very room with Minister Sijarto, with Minister Vašikovský, with Minister Lajčák, and with Minister Zaorálek. All three were dominating the debate about migration, and our minister didn't say a thing. And why is so? Because the same appeal that Sijarto is doing, I'm sorry for being so specific, to the Hungarians, these things have appeal in the Czech Republic too. And the Social Democrats, they have to get some votes too. So simply the Czech Republic did not try hard. But I'm not saying it will work, and it was a very important question point that Ben raised. If we are ready to pull the plug at some point, but my take on it is that it's simply not brave if we see that something that is really, really beneficial for the region, and we see that someone is stealing that away, and we leave the fight even before it even begins. That's not what I would call a brave thing. That's not the leadership. So we should try harder. And that I hope would kind of respond to Mr. Ambassador. I don't think we should withdraw. And there is one more thing that you said, a very important thing, that the Western world came to understand the Visegrad Group some 3 years ago. But I would say that the golden times of the Visegrad Group were around 2012, 2011, when it was really putting strong initiatives on the European table regarding the Eastern Partnership, regarding Western Balkans, and when it really helped the region to socialize, and so on and so on. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's the misunderstanding, and maybe it's a willing misunderstanding of what the Visegrad Group is, because basically the economists adopted the Hungarian narrative. So once again, I am very critical of the development in Central Europe, but I just don't think that the Visegrad Group as a format of cooperation is to blame for it.
Thank you very much, Michal. I think there will indeed be quite a few responses to that, but first we're going to come to Rudolf first, and first things first, I suppose. So, Rudolf, please, on Czech-Chinese relations.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for your valuable comments and questions. I would start with the position of Czech Strategic Partnership within the whole China-EU strategic partnership. I would point to individual strategic partnerships of important big EU member states, as for example Germany, UK, and the others. In this perspective, the Czech individual bilateral ties do not go beyond the mainstream. Let's compare the Czech strategic partnership with China, with Serbia. I think the Serbia it's a different case. The Czech foreign policy is of course traditionally much more pro-Western. And if we take the case of very specific partnership of Serbia with China, we can see that there is a relevant shift of Serbian policy, which is more highlighting the future EU membership. As to the potential corruption and risks with, let's say, the non-transparent Chinese financial resources that look their opportunities in the Czech Republic. I think this is a special case for intelligence services that are supposed to screen those developments very carefully. My personal opinion is open. I would say that it might be a potential risk, or maybe it is not. It depends on the specific situation. The CEFC financial group has been listed in Western countries, as for example in USA, in Canada, and in Germany. So our operatives have opportunity to do inquire, to do research and consultation with our foreign partners. As to the dilemma, either value support for values, support for human rights, either the business. I would point at the case of other democratic EU member states that they conduct the similar policies with China, especially Germany and the others, and more typical the Polish diplomacy. My concern is that there is, despite a very large consensus of Czech political elites, our public relations sometimes do not make a positive view for foreign observers, as for example the interviews that were provided by President Zeman, who mentioned that Czech Republic is no longer limited in developing our bilateral relations with China from USA and from EU. I doubt that, for example, EU would make any pressure on us how we deal with the Chinese, because the currently EU policy is very much supportive for the especially the economic cooperation with China. As to the other projects, we are somehow bypassed by the large infrastructure deals. Maybe there are some on the table, as for example the connection or the river corridor Elbe, Oder and Donau, which seems to be somehow very complicated, even so that receives a high-level political support.
Thank you very much indeed, Rudolf. We will have time for one more round of questions as we're going to cut into the break, but first just a couple of remarks in response to what has been said, using my privilege as moderator and discussant. Michal Kořan, following your logic on Visegrad, if we do accept your logic, then what is required is strong leadership. If we don't see that coming from the Czech side, then indeed there is no point remaining. If there is no transformative potential, because you said indeed the challenge is to lead, to shape Visegrad in the better image that you want it to be, and to take it in a more perhaps liberal way, without the possibility to do that, and if nothing changes from the leadership position that you've described as being so lacking, and in which indeed I think many of us also saw when the 4 foreign ministers were sitting here, then without that there is no point continuing. Or possibly at least maybe one could make a case for a temporary withdrawal. As General Davidson from Australia recently put it, what you walk past is what you are willing to accept and even perhaps endorse. And indeed, when Minister Zaoralek did so, endorsing in effect, by inaction, the positions of Minister Siarto and others, it marked, I think, potentially for a lot of us, a turning point in the Visegrad relations. Czech Republic does not need to be tarred by that brush. It does not need to be tarred by the brush of a Europe or of a Visegrad group that seeks to take responsibility by trying to foment cultural counter-revolution in Europe and overturning liberal values. Doing so is not only anathema to the Czech strategic position, as Michal Šimečka outlined, but it is also morally unacceptable. So I would leave my remarks at that for now. And I know Ambassador Weiss has a question, and also Vít Beneš has a question. Are there any others or comments or questions that people would like to add? Yes, also Jakub Groszkowski. Any more for any more of the gentlemen over there? Okay, so in that order, please. Ambassador Weiss first, and I ask you to keep your remarks concise, please.
Thank you. I would like to support what Mr. Kořan said. V4 is for us in this region something very important. We could not see it only because the quota, it provoked a conflict. And we see how this conflict started to be solved. For my country, for example, without V4, we wouldn't have such a good, unexpectedly good relations with Hungary. It is an achievement. And when somebody is only so telling us, go out because you don't have the same approach to the liberal democracy like in Polish Republic that can see, so it would be against our national interests. And secondly, Visegrad 4 survived several crises because there are political cycles. The governments are here not forever. And because one conflict to dissolve Visegrad 4, so it would be something it only would worsen the stability in the region. It is a factor of cohesion, very important one. Also, other countries have their own regional consultations, frameworks, and they are trying to use this regional framework for be more successful in this complicated field on the European policies. But on the other side, yesterday Professor Gatti explained us the general situation in the world and in the politics. Do you think that what can we with concern see in some parts of political spectrum in our Visegrad 4 countries is not to be observed in the United States, in other countries? And when there is many times questioning the issue of attitudes to Muslims in our countries, I could ask you, explain us, Mr. Tallis, how is it possible that in the oldest democracy in Europe was able to create such a hatred against citizens of the European Union? Against Poles. Where was responsibility and leadership of British leaders from elite schools? And when such a thing was possible in Great Britain, why are you wondering that we have also problems in this region 25 years after the transformation?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Weiss. We'll move to Vít Beneš for a comment. Please keep it short, though.
Yeah, just a few short comments.
Can you limit it to one, please, because we really are running out of time?
Really short. I don't agree with the idea that we can dismiss the external perceptions of the Visegrad 4 simply as misunderstandings. Visegrad 4 is not what we make of it. Visegrad 4 is what the international community makes of it. So it includes the external perceptions. Second, it's funny, the Czech Republic kept complaining about France and Germany setting the agenda of European integration. Today we are complaining about a much smaller country like Hungary setting the agenda of Visegrad 4. So probably the ability to set the agenda has nothing to do with the size of the country, but really with the ability to generate leadership and I would rather say ideas, political ideas. You know, the difference between Orbán and Czech politicians is that Orbán has a certain vision of Europe. He has a certain political vision. I don't agree with that vision, but he has a certain European vision. And he even is able to find allies in Europe who would share that vision. For example, in Bavaria. The problem with the Czech politics is that we tend to wait and see. We have no vision of what kind of Europe we want. So therefore, we are kind of surprised that those who have a certain vision steal the agenda.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, my memory fails me. Jakub Groszkowski, please, and then we will turn to the gentleman here and then come back to it for a final word from our panelists. Jakub, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Maybe not very surprisingly, I would like to oppose to the idea that the river has been hijacked by Poland and Hungary. I perceive it as a strong simplification. As you gave the migration policy as the main example of this hijackedness, I would say rather that the river has been hijacked by the interior ministers, because when you look at the migration policies that are actually realized in in the region. And when you look at the interior ministries from the region, they seem to agree on almost everything. So we have a divergence in rhetorics, slight divergence in rhetorics when it comes to prime ministers, but not so much in practical steps of migration policy. And I would just give an example of the united Visegrad effort in helping Hungary to secure the badly perceived in the West the wall on the border with Hungary. Thank you. Hungarian-Serbian border. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. The final comment over here, and indeed, please keep it concise. Thank you.
Václav Němec, I'm from the Government Council for Sustainable Development. I had already yesterday pleasure to, when was some discussion about China, and in the evening, I would say just a few sentences and one important recommendation. We are in a double danger of nuclear war and danger of forces of the nature, which are not under the control of humanity. The world is sick and we need peace, and this is only diplomatic efforts which can be used. We can say if the world is sick, we need some bypasses. And I think that this is the role of smaller countries also. And for instance, Czechia is now the unique, I think if I remember well, that we are the unique European embassy in Syria, for instance. Something similar was in the old socialist era, when Romania has contacts with Israel and so on. So scientists, artists can help with some humanization of ties, and of course businessmen and technicians and so on can help in this. The science is corrupted, and so I think that we have to do everything just, and this is a role, a very positive role of the Visegrad Group, which can be done. And my last recommendation. This is now just there will be a final election of the new United Nations Secretary. It is according to the tradition. So the Eastern Europe has a right, and it has been also recommended that it should be good to have the first women General Secretary. And I know the list of people, and respectful people, both women, ladies and gentlemen. But I think that the only person which can really help and who knows that is Irina Bokova from UNESCO, because she has made a lot of good maths, and I think that it would be good to make some correction. Yes, that's all what I wanted. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed for the comment. I think there's much we could all agree in there, the role of smaller states and indeed the importance of culture, art and other activities in politics. Perhaps the V4 might consider limiting itself to such activities rather than having delusions of adequacy, as it seems to at the moment. I think I will ask our panelists to finally respond, and then I will respond to the question that was finally put to me about the UK, and then we will close and move on to lunch. So please, in the order that you presented, Michal Šimečka, then Rudolf first, then Michal Kořan. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. So just a few final remarks, and unsurprisingly, on Visegrad, and coming back to Michal's argument, when he says that we shouldn't blame the Visegrad Cooperation, the format itself, for what we see today, and for the political stances of its member states, and xenophobic or otherwise. I'm not entirely sure that's the case. I mean, I would guess that there's a sort of institutional argument to be made that actually the cooperative spirit in which these positions are pursued actually reinforces the xenophobic positions of each member state, in the sense that perhaps not, but some of the, at least in Slovakia or even in Hungary, they would be much more careful, its leaders would be much more careful in voicing these often quite radical positions if they weren't sort of under the cover of a joint Visegrad platform. So perhaps rather than being an instrument of moderation, it might actually be a double-edged sword in the sense that it encourages the worst of us, because it always provides us with a political cover of we're not alone in voicing these radical opinions. Now talking about prime ministers or indeed foreign ministers who are here. So that's one point. And the very final point is, and I absolutely take the argument about how Visegrad's value, or Visegrad's value in sort of regional stability, cohesion, trust, and what would it look like without Visegrad? What would Central Europe look like without Visegrad? But I think we also need to sort of see kind of put it in perspective and to understand the seriousness of the situation today, because the positive role in regional stability and cooperation that Visegrad has played was only possible, or was largely a product of European integration, and and the reason why Visegrad played this positive role was because of the overall framework of the European kind of unity, integration process and all that, which then should be, if we think about it strategically, this is the strategic objective of the Czech Republic, to safeguard that European framework. And at this point, we might come up to a point when Visegrad is actually the one element which threatens to destroy the European project. And all the kind of stability, cohesion that we have, grown accustomed to in Central Europe. So, just to get a sense of how and maybe that would be the time when to say that, that's just too much.
Thank you very much, Michal. Rudolf.
My summary on the Czech-Chinese agenda would be quite positive. I appreciate the more communicative way of recent Czech-Chinese relations. I think this is better than close the door and just remain on the ideological view of the East and West. The Czech experience with the Chinese, it's very comparable and very similar to other European states. So I appreciate the process of Europeization of Czech-Chinese policy. As to the issue of identity, of our character, of our sense for values, I think China is not primarily the threat. If we lose our identity and if we lose our moral level, that would be not China to blame for it. Thank you.
Yes, perhaps we should look closer to home. Michal, Kořan.
Thank you. It's an extremely inspiring conversation. Thank you for that, gentlemen, and I know we will continue. Even though I completely disagree with everything you said. First of all, there is no evidence that the cooperative nature reinforces the bad, while we have plenty of evidence that the moderating effect on, and let's say disciplining effect on Hungary in times, especially with regard to Russia, is there. There is an evidence for that, while we don't have evidence for the other thing. To Ben's point, what exactly, and this is a literal question, we will talk about that later, but what would you get by getting out of the Visegrad Group? You would maybe get a little better image, which with our president and with whatever we will get from the next parliamentary election, we will lose the good image anyway. We would get a good feeling that we did not somehow betray our values, but we do betray our values every day. The very deal with Turkey is betraying our values, because the conditions that the refugees live in are terrible. It's just that we pay so that we don't see it. So should we leave the EU too? And while what we would lose is much greater. We would lose the invisible Visegrad, which probably is so invisible that we don't bother to study it. But that's the important thing. And I would counter what Michal said. It's not that Visegrad Group is because of the European Union. The overall stability, yes, of course. But the long-term process of socialization, of building trust, was at times actually done in spite of the European Union and in spite of the European Commission. The Germans didn't like the Visegrad at times when everything was okay. So anyway, I enjoyed this discussion, and it's a very important discussion. Thank you for that, Ben.
Well, thank you, Michal. It takes two, or in this case three, to tango, for sure. I think to respond first to that and then to Peter Weiss's comment, you say there's no evidence that the Visegrad Group cooperation has had this echo chamber effect, this reinforcing effect